Morning in Patriot City. People rush to work, enmeshed in their everyday lives. But what does the man of the street make of our heroes? Only they could provide the answers.
Freedom Force? Bah! I bet those mugs don't even exist!
Freedom Force?
Freedom Force is a satirical superhero tactics game, and specifically because of that, I need to talk about some timeline context before I get into anything else. Because not only does this predate the MCU, which you could probably already guess just from the dated graphics, Freedom Force also predates the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy as well. That means the biggest, most mainstream Marvel media out there when this game came out was the first two Blade movies. Which I really like, by the way, don't get me wrong. And that completely changes up the tone and focus of the series because it obviously can't parody stuff that doesn't exist yet. Meaning there's a lot more freedom, no pun intended, to poke fun at stuff that normally would be way too niche nowadays. And by the way, for people who are asking, what about DC though? Yeah, there are a few DC parody characters like Robin and Martian Manhunter, but overwhelmingly, the poster boys for the series are characters like Captain America, Iron Man, and Spider-Man. Speaking of which, let's check out Captain America's, or should I say Minuteman's, origin story, because it's the perfect first taste of the goofy retro tone that Freedom Force riffs on.
An old man sits on a park bench, thinking of a time shrouded in the past. His name is Frank Styles, and he was once one of the brilliant young scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project, the secret experiment that ushered in the wonders and terrors of the atomic age. It was his work that helped secure America's position as the leader of the free world. But Frank's memories are tinged with bitterness. He was thrown off the project when he accused one of his fellow scientists of being a communist spy. And now he sits in this park, every day feeling a little older and a little more useless.
Just a minute. I recognize that man. It's O'Connor from the Manhattan Project. They never did believe me he was working for the Reds. But who's that suspicious fellow he's talking to? It looks like they're making some kind of secret exchange. I better move in closer for a better listen.
Have you got the documents?
Do you have my money?
By Lenin's ghost. Is that all you Americans think about? The almighty dollar?
Damn, I've been discovered.
Idiot! You've been followed.
Up to your old tricks, O'Connor?
Do you know this capitalist fool?
This is an itch I've been waiting to scratch for 20 years.
We must flee before we are discovered. Come on!
Bullet entered my heart, fading fast. Wait, statue of the Minuteman, glowing, as if it were calling out to me. Power surging into me. I am growing younger, body bursting with strength. Feel like I could lift 1,000 pounds. That statue must have been hit with some fantastic kind of energy, but it's fading. It must have completely transferred it into my body. I don't know what will come from all of this, but I must use these new powers to help my country fight her enemies within and without. Those Reds might have killed Frank Styles, but they're about to meet a Minuteman.
Your neighbor could be a secret Soviet, your milkman could be a secret Soviet, or maybe the Soviet spy is just standing in the middle of a public park making a deal within earshot of everyone, wearing a Ushanka with a big red star plastered on it. Like, this is exactly what I imagine this kind of old, insecure man daydreams about as he shakes his cane at the kids on his lawn and makes up stories about walking both ways uphill, unlike the Kabi youth of today. It's one of those things where the devs are so good at hitting where they're aiming that you immediately know what they're making fun of. But, of course, in the ridiculous, campy world of Freedom Force, it's all real and completely serious, not just the conspiracies of a guilt-ridden ancient fossil. And that comes along with all the other weirdos and silly horrors the devs cooked up as villains for the game. I think that while this may be more of a Marvel spoof, no other game has felt closer to a Justice League simulator than this. All sorts of crazy stuff pops off every chapter, from giant ants stealing the city to recreated underground to purple gangsters and psychotic architects. And this diverse rogues gallery isn't in the game just because it's fun to get surprised with whatever weird spoof villain they throw at you next. It's also just straight up mechanically important, because similar to a Pokemon game, a lot of the strategy of Freedom Force involves elemental weaknesses and resistances. And it's not just a suggestion either. You show up to a mission with the wrong team setup, and you'll get crushed no matter how good you are. But unlike a lot of games where you can get pretty far into a mission before realizing you screwed it up from the start, Freedom Force will make it immediately clear you're not finishing the level without some insane luck. It seems like, to me, the flow of the game is designed so that you start a new chapter with new mechanics, get your ass handed to you, and then show up with a new crew that can at least go toe-to-toe. As the chapter goes on, you adapt better and better to the new villain. Picking up speed, you start to steamroll through enemies, up until the end of the chapter where everything you've learned is put to the test, either being easier or hard depending on how well you've figured out how to deal with the villain of the week's mechanics. And then the cycle repeats next chapter with your ass getting handed to you again. This works so effectively because it actually forces you to take each new supervillain seriously, despite their goofy characterization, because they will absolutely tear you apart if you don't play smart, which is exactly what a good tactics game should reward. But if you play the game and keep getting beat because you can't seem to field a decent team of heroes, it's because you failed to utilize one of Freedom Force's best mechanics, and that's its extensive character creator. This thing is amazing. I had no idea just how many effects, powers, and parameters there were in this game until I started really messing with it. I mean, look how long it takes me to scroll through this passive trait list, and that doesn't even include the actual powers and attacks you can create. All these custom heroes are completely usable, not just in Freedom Force's version of the Danger Room, but also in the main story as well, purchasable with the same points you use to unlock all the optional heroes. In fact, one of the weird balance choices is that the custom-made heroes tend to be more powerful than base heroes, even for similar point values. Now, this could just be bad design or intentional, but either way, it actually sort of balances the overall game difficulty. it prevents you from just bringing a complete team of powerhouses. Instead, you have to really consider what heroes best support your custom ones on any given mission. And on top of that, when you actually get into situations where the pre-built heroes really shine, it's super satisfying to see them pull off fights that normally only your overpowered custom heroes would be able to do. That being said, I might be giving off the impression that the standard heroes are pushovers, which they're very much not. Because in order to compensate for not being able to choose their powers, pre-built heroes have 3 different ability trees you can buy powers from and spend experience points to upgrade. And since you're not going to be buying everything, what you do choose matters a lot, because some of them can drastically change how you utilize each hero. A good example of this that pretty much every guide will cite is Manbot. Normally this character is one of the more powerful uses required for many missions, but his slow speed and general lack of accuracy hampers his ability to be useful. In many missions, you'll have to rush all over the map to protect buildings or civilians, only for your fast heroes to arrive and get crushed instantly, because the supporting characters they need just aren't fast enough. Manbot especially slows down your team because he's one of the few characters who can give energy to your allies and drain it from foes, energy most heroes need for their abilities. But if you spend experience points on his traits, eventually you'll unlock Flyer, which immediately changes how you'll use him on teams. Instead of being this lumbering battery you sort of tug along behind you, Manbot becomes this floating turret able to reach any point on the map easily. His energy leech area of effect stops being something you need to risk melee combat with, because now you can just zip above a group of enemies and energy tap them before they even get a chance to use any of their powerful attacks. His inaccurate but damaging ranged attacks become consistent ways to eliminate high-value targets by flying right above them and raining down energy beams while continuously recharging using the previously mentioned ability. It essentially ends up feeling like you're playing a completely different character without losing any of the utility they had. And because there are so many options to spec into with each hero, it becomes up to you what kind of new role they end up being able to fill. This isn't overpowered either, for 2 big reasons. First off, the abilities you need to fully embrace these new roles usually come with downsides. In the previous example, as long as Manbot is flying, his energy regen rate goes down dramatically, meaning you can't utilize him like the walking battery he was, unless you keep him grounded. Key to this is you can dynamically choose whether or not to do this at any point during a mission, instead of it being something you pick at the beginning of a level. And the second reason it's not OP is that timing is actually incredibly important. Even though you'd think that being able to pause and queue actions would make that less relevant. Because every second that your game is unpaused and enemies are in range of you or an objective, they're actively lowering your chances of winning the mission. In a lot of strategy games, the enemy AI will sometimes just waste chances. Anyone familiar with XCOM knows there are times when you're convinced you're going to lose a character, only for opponents to do some kind of stupid debuff or buff instead that gives you just enough time to swing back the flow of the fight in your favor. But in Freedom Force, you almost actually prefer if the villains choose a direct attack, because at least they can roll a miss or low damage or maybe hit a character with good resistances. If they throw up an active defense you can't deal with, or cast fear on the hero you're about to use to protect an objective, you're completely screwed. And that isn't even taking into consideration the fact that if they do use a direct attack, a bunch could roll really well on one of your heroes and immediately take them out before you even have a chance to use their one heal. A big part of why I think I'm not as good at this game as I really could be is because my brain is so programmed by other tactics games to devalue non-damaging abilities when playing against a computer as opposed to another human. Unlike those games, in Freedom Force, the better you understand how to use your status effect powers, and the more you have, the more you're able to break up groups of villains and actually have a decent chance of winning. Because in the same way that every second the enemy can use abilities, you grow closer to losing, every second the enemy can't use abilities, you grow closer to winning. And that's really where the fights in Freedom Force become intense. And because that's so important, it makes what abilities you pick on level up that much more of a thoughtful question. Maybe in one playthrough you first invest all your points into making some beam attack do more damage, which works for a while till you encounter an enemy that straight up blocks it with a shield, and you have to switch around your whole team. But in another playthrough, you invest in playing up a variety of abilities in a different ability tree, but subsequently leave your attacks pretty weak. And yeah, it's tough at first, but once you hit that mission you had so much trouble with, it turns out this time around you surprisingly blaze through it. I know when I was a kiddo back in the early 2000s, I never even went down the tree where Manbot gets flying, and didn't even realize he could get it until I played the sequel. In a lot of tactics games with RPG level-up mechanics, while gaining experience does feel like it's developing your character further down the path they're already kinda set on, rarely do they let you completely change the playstyle and role of a character as drastically as you can in a full-blown RPG. And it's not just in the level-up mechanics that Freedom Force outshines its competition. This game really tries to capture the way environments dynamically affect superhero fights. Buildings fall down, cars explode, and most importantly, depending on your character's strength rating, objects can be picked up, swung, and thrown around. This isn't just a gimmick either. Using objects is really effective, if not downright necessary for some missions and characters. And especially if the teammates you've got don't have the right powers to beat the enemy resistances, or maybe they all got KO'd and now all you have left is a hero with bad matchups. Then picking up objects becomes a way to change up what brand of damage you're using. Need crushing? Throw a rock. Need fire? Throw a barrel. In fact, there are multiple powers that do stuff like blow up objects or turn villains into objects. The thing is that in this early era of 3D game engines, this was near groundbreaking. There was almost nothing out there with this level of environmental interaction. Like, sure, there were games like Black and White, or whichever one you're thinking of, but most of the time it was kind of the sole focus of the game, the main gimmick. Rarely did you get a game that could have been complete without it, but still just had that extra layer of object utility and destructible cities added. And here's the punchline to that. It's still true 20 years later. I mean, people talk about the destructible environments in Battlefield as a way to contrast against Call of Duty because the feature is still so uncommon that everyone sees it as a novel selling point. And yeah, now Call of Duty is doing it a bit too, but really both are, I am sorry, but overhyped ways of implementing dynamic maps and bullet penetration, things that are not that uncommon or impressive at this point. At most you get games like XCOM having walls blow up as like a half-baked tactics choice that the engine can't even handle all that well when trying to calculate accuracy. Which, by the way, if anyone is interested, Phoenix Point completely fixes if anyone wants an XCOM game with reasonable hit probability. But you're not throwing exhaust vents at people, you're not using traffic lights as swords. In fact, going back to superheroes, I can't think of a single Marvel or DC or just generic comic book game in general where environmental objects play such a huge role. Which is absolutely baffling to me, considering every single superpower battle I have ever seen in a comic or a movie involves all sorts of objects flying around and being used as makeshift weapons and shields. Maybe I just don't understand because I don't generally like superhero stuff all that much. But I look at games like the Arkham Asylum series, or especially that newish Marvel Avengers with its sterile, bland combat arenas, and just I wonder what happened. Like, don't get me wrong, the recent Spider-Man games and the older Ultimate Alliance games definitely try to do this a little. And they're good games, just like the Arkham games are good games. But they still feel to me like generalized third-person action games, wearing superhero spandex. With the obvious exception of the web swinging, which I'm sure people will get mad at me if I don't add how excellent that is, okay? Freedom Force, on the other hand, feels like a superhero game to its very core. Not like someone wanted to put their favorite hero in a genre that's been polished by a million different games. Instead, Freedom Force comes off like every mechanic was designed to recreate comic book fights, and it just so happened to end up being a tactics strategy game with RPG elements completely naturally. In fact, something I've always dreamed about is a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure game close to this style. I think that would be such a perfect matchup. and the fact that JoJo's stand abilities tend to be much more creative and much less in the vein of, my ability does damage. I could see the game creating some super interesting scenarios where you're trying to figure out how your opponent's powers work as you're using the environment and objects to protect yourself. But that's probably a pipe dream that'll never happen because everyone seems satisfied playing third-person action games with the exact same mechanics over and over again as long as they reskin it with their favorite characters. Because we all know companies are going to come up with the completely wrong reasons for why a game like Marvel Avengers flops. I mean, now that the new Matrix movie is out, there's a chance we'll get some more games based on that franchise, and all I can think is how amazing it would be if they took the interactivity Freedom Force developed and somehow incorporated that into a Matrix game. And I don't mean one-to-one. I've made peace with the fact that these slower tactics games and RPG games are not popular anymore, so I'm not saying make another game exactly like this. But I think there are so many video game concepts that get prototyped in games like this that then just disappear because the genre goes out of fashion, even though you don't need to do this genre at all to incorporate these mechanics. There's no reason you can't have wreckable buildings and wieldable park benches in a third-person action game. There's no reason you can't have RPG mechanics that give you the choice to drastically change how a character plays in a third-person action game or, even an FPS. We've successfully done fusion when it comes to cooking, and yet publishers are incapable of understanding that there's a treasure trove of abandoned mechanics in old games that they could fuse into modern genres. And what you do get is elements. They always give you RPG elements, or strategy elements, or FPS elements. Elements that are so boiled down that they serve as more of a pre-release selling point to get you to pre-order rather than fleshed out mechanics that set the game apart from the rest in a way that Freedom Force's diversity of options do. Ubisoft games are a great example of this. They always shove RPG elements into stuff like Assassin's Creed and Far Cry. I've heard maybe Far Cry 6 is different, haven't played it, but going just by all the rest of the games in the series, would you really feel any different about Far Cry 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever if you unlocked all the abilities just naturally as the story progressed? If they completely removed the level up system, you'd still buy the game because almost all of the mechanics and things you like about those games would be pretty much entirely unchanged. But if you take away the RPG mechanics from Freedom Force, you're looking at a drastically different game, even though you would still have a strategy game about parody superheroes where you pause and tactically use powers. And that's because unlike the formulaic game design that most big publishers prefer, every element of gameplay design in Freedom Force is core to how you play the game. And yeah, there's a lot about Freedom Force that's old. There's a lot of clunky design, dated writing, and unpolished difficulty balancing. But that's the entire point of building on media that came before. Modernize the characters and narratives, get rid of the offensive stuff, clean up the janky controls, and make it faster, and you've got what I think could be an instant hit. I'd go so far as to predict that if big companies keep ignoring the potential of old game mechanics like this, then it's only a matter of time before some indie dev jumps on it first. And considering how much money games like Undertale, Hotline Miami, and Among Us can make without the big marketing budget major publishers have access to, it's almost like they're burning money. And trust me, I am all for these companies losing out to indie devs, but it doesn't make it any less baffling. To be fair, I guess then they'd actually have to start paying people to come up with ideas, which, as we all know, is an unnecessary expense compared to hiring a famous actor to do mocap or putting up commercials everyone ad blocks.
Just think who you want to communicate with, and I'll transmit the message through their minds.
Holy cow!